cyclist or the wretched young man who cycles up behind people whizzing along?
I'm generally fairly careful when I go around Cambridge, and then I go faster when I do longer distance rides, like the big bike ride for charity a couple of weeks ago. You have to go a bit faster if you're going to cover 125 miles in a day.
Yes, indeed. So, on a more general point, do you support the calls made by Bradley Wiggins for helmets, iPods and phones to be banned?
No, I mean, Bradley is an amazing rider, and it was fantastic to see him ride both in the Olympics and in the Tour de France. I mean, he really stunning performances. But on this, he's not right. He actually said some other things. He said, for example, that cyclists should wear lights at night, and that's absolutely right. That is already the law, and I hope the police do more to enforce that. But on cycle helmets, he really, unfortunately, is wrong in what he says. There's a lot of evidence that shows that having compulsory helmet laws means that fewer people cycle. And that actually means that you get more accidents, as well as the fact that because people are less fit, you get a larger number of deaths from heart attacks and various other things like that. It really is a bad idea. It also gets across the message that cycling isn't a safe thing to do, whereas in fact it really is a safe thing to do.
Do you really believe that people wouldn't get their bike out if a helmet was compulsory? People who need to bike to work, need to bike to the shops, need to bike to school would say, I am not going to get my bike out of the shed because I've got to put a helmet on. I mean, this is the line that's trotted out all the time by the pro-cycling lobby, but do you really believe it?
Absolutely, because there have been lots of studies looking at places around the world where they have introduced compulsory helmet laws. Australia is the classic example, where they introduced compulsory helmet laws and they saw a very significant decline in the number of people cycling, particularly children. Because it's not the established cyclists who wouldn't get the helmet out. It's the people who are trying to work out, how am I going to get to work? I've just got a job. How do I get to school? How do I do when I've changed something? And they say, I could get a bike, but I'd also have to have a helmet. It means that people find it harder to do. It's harder to use a hire bike. You couldn't have a sort of Boris bike scheme, which they have in Australia. They've had problems because there aren't helmets available, so people have to carry their own helmets if they think they might want to use a bike. So the evidence is actually really, really clear that in places where they have introduced compulsory helmet rules, they've seen a reduction in people cycling. What they haven't seen is a reduction in serious incidents.
Headway say, however, that people should always wear a helmet, and they are an organisation who have to deal with people who've had an accident, not necessarily exclusively on a bicycle, but they are the experts, and they say helmets should be worn.
Firstly, there's a big difference between whether people choose to wear a helmet or whether you have a compulsory rule to make people do it. It's the compulsory rule that has the really bad effect on making people not cycle and with all the harm that come from that. But the key point is that cycling is actually a fairly safe thing to do. Even in London, which is one of the busiest areas, there's about one death for every 6 million journeys. That's incredibly low, and people should go out and cycle. Now, there are various estimates of how many lives might be saved from wearing helmets, but they're small numbers. The best estimate is something like 12. Now, those are 12 important things, and people can choose. But actually, cyclists are much more likely to be injured, not through head injuries. If you look at the death yesterday, which caused Bradley Wiggins to make his comments, what happened there was a heavy goods vehicle that essentially just ran over him and went over his abdomen and rode straight over the bike. There's no way a helmet would help. And actually what we need to be concentrating on is better training for cyclists and for drivers, better sensors on the big heavy goods vehicles that are responsible for a huge number of the accidents, and better infrastructure around the country.
As you might expect, this has polarised opinion once again. John in Warrington says they should have the same law as in Holland. If a motorist hits a cyclist, then the motorist is always at fault. But I want to read you this message who says, could you ask Julian Huppert to comment on a story that appeared in the Cambridge News not long ago, where he said he feels that in the case of a collision between a cyclist and a motor vehicle, there should always be a presumption of guilt and responsibility on the part of the motorist. Now, this listener doesn't agree with this. John in Warrington does. Do you always do you stand by that claim that you reportedly made?
Yeah, this is an approach called proportionate liability, which is very common in the rest of Europe. And the way it works is if there's no reason to think anything else, if you don't know what else happened, then the driver of a more dangerous vehicle is deemed to be responsible sort of by default. So in the case of a heavy goods vehicle hitting a car, the driver of the heavy goods vehicle would be deemed to be responsible if there's no other information, and so on for a car hitting a cyclist, or indeed a cyclist hitting a pedestrian. It doesn't make it, I wouldn't support an automatic thing that says it's that whatever else. If, for example, you have evidence that there was a cyclist who rode straight out at night without any lights on and behaved ridiculously, then you would change that rule. But rather than say, but it means you have a default, and that would encourage people to be a bit safer. So yes, I do think that's a good idea.
And just finally, a comment on something which you said earlier, and I must admit it did occur to me. Marie says, how does he think people would feel if the theory he's just applied was applied to seatbelts in cars? It's infuriated me. In other words, you're saying that, it shouldn't be compulsory, and yet seatbelts in cars are, and people didn't like that when it was first introduced, Julian.
I think there are quite a few differences between the seatbelt system and cycling. One is, frankly, seatbelts haven't stopped people from going out to drive. You still have a very strong push around the country that people will drive even for extremely short trips where a car probably isn't that appropriate. And there isn't the health benefits from driving that there are from cycling. But it's also about the type of injuries. If you are unfortunate enough to have an accident on a bike, you are much more likely to injure your arms or your legs, frankly, than your head. It's actually quite rare for the head to be involved. Whereas that's not the case in terms of the injuries that a seatbelt protects against. Almost any collision is likely to cause you to go forwards or backwards. So seatbelts actually help in a much wider number of injuries. Whereas for cycling, cycle helmets, frankly, don't help against most of the injuries. And even if there is a head collision, they're less effective than most people think.
It's been really good to talk to you. We could go on and on, but time has caught up with us. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. All the best.
Cheers. That's the Liberal Democrat MP for Cambridge, Julian Huppert.